Welcome to today's lesson on canoe paddles. So I'm going to start by grabbing one of my favorite paddles. Okay, so this is a really nice paddle. Now, one of the things I want to identify is that there is a big difference between a canoe paddle and a kayak paddle, just like there's a difference between canoes and kayaks. All right, so I have a kayak paddle here because I also do some kayaking, and you'll notice that it is double-sided, so it has a blade on both ends or a paddling area on both ends. We are not using kayak paddles, okay? They tend to pop apart in the middle like this one, okay? So I can take it apart for storage. It's kind of handy, but we will not be using these on our canoe trips, okay? So that's the kayak paddle. The canoe paddle, one blade. Let's just go over the parts, starting with the blade here. On the end of the blade, we have a tip. And it's not uncommon for the tip to be made out of something special, okay? In this particular case, there's some epoxy on this tip. I'm just gonna bring it up nice and close. You can see that this end here, I cover with my finger, is made out of epoxy. It's a hard plastic that's put on so that we can't damage it. You can see how the paddle's actually been damaged a little bit where the wood part is here, and the epoxy part is actually in really good shape. Most paddles are made out of wood still today. You do see some made out of plastic, metal, and the really good ones are made out of Kevlar or carbon fiber, much like my kayak paddle, and they're lighter and very strong and stiff, okay? So we have the tip, we have the blade, and then as we move to the other end, we have what's known as the throat. And the throat is where the shaft, which is this part, comes to the blade, okay? And we call this part here the throat. And then on the other end, we have what's known as the grip. And there are different types of grips. Some are symmetrical and some are asymmetrical. Symmetrical means you can grab the paddle either way, and asymmetrical means it's designed for being held one specific way. So I show you here, this has a dish on it. It's designed to be held like this, in this manner, okay? And not like that, okay? So your hands cup around and grab onto it. So this is referred to as a asymmetrical grip, okay? Most paddles are not asymmetrical, they're symmetrical. The ones you will use we rent in Algonquin and on the Saugeen trip are generally symmetrical. So you can grab them either way, which makes it kind of nice. Now, when you're sizing a paddle up, they generally have a principle, which is if you hold your arms out like this, they want the length of the paddle to go from the grip to the throat to be about elbow to elbow. So if you hold the paddle up over your head at 90 degrees, it should be elbow to elbow. You might notice that this one's a little small on me. That's normal because this is a paddle for my wife. This is my wife's paddle, okay? It's not mine. A couple other neat features. Sometimes you see these color stripes in here. This is just decorative. Okay, so what they've done is they've laminated some cherry wood in between some, I believe it's pine in here, some fairly clear pine, and so they just makes for a nice coloring of the paddle. Okay, so again, sizing it up, hold the paddle over your head and you're from the throat to here, or at least that's your hand position. If the paddle's a lot longer, you can leave a little space between the throat and where your hand goes, and it just gives you an idea of where to hold your hands on the paddle. You don't want to have them really close together and you don't want to have them really wide apart. You want to kind of be in that elbow to elbow at 90 degrees, okay? Okay, so those are the parts of the paddle. We definitely have also what's called the different shapes, okay? And it's generally looking at the shape of the blade. And this particular paddle is known as an otter tail blade. It's fairly long and narrow, okay? And long and narrow otter tail blades are usually used for lake paddle. They allow you to get the paddle deep into the water where the water is the most still and give you the best ability to paddle the canoe really, really well. I wouldn't say it's the most popular shape paddle blade, but it's fairly popular, especially for people in the bow. And you do see a fair number of people out there with otter tail paddles, okay? The most common shape, though, is probably what's known as the beaver tail paddle, okay? And this is a beaver tail. You can see it's a little wider here, and it cuts across stays straight in this area and then rounds off on the tip, okay? And this is what they know is known as a beaver tail. There's a little bit more surface area on the face of the paddle, okay? On the blade of the paddle, there's more surface area, more room to pull the paddle along. And this is sort of your nice in-between paddle. It's very common to see this style with rounded. You'll see here, this one does not have a tip on it, and so the specialized epoxy tip, the tip is just wood, and it's taken quite a beating. You can even see a small crack in the paddle right here. This is a fairly inexpensive paddle, maybe $20 or so to purchase this paddle. Not a lot of money, and actually pretty good paddle. It is a smaller one. Again, symmetrical, so you'll see here as I come closer, symmetrical means it's the same on both sides, so I can hold this paddle this way or I can hold it this way. It doesn't really matter how I hold the paddle. Just a real emphasis though is your hand is always on the top of the paddle here. It's a big no-no to hold the paddle like this, and I see students do this quite often. Usually by the end of the trip it's gone because kids do kind of pick up on it, but you know, we really want to try to paddle our canoe here, and this allows us some ability to rotate it with our wrist. You can see how I can quite easily spin the paddle this way, better so than this way. I suppose you can still do it this way, but it is about having a little bit more torque, a little more strength that way. And again, my hand is right around the throat. This one's just a tad bigger than the last paddle I had, but still maybe a touch small on me. I kind of like my paddles a little small as opposed to too big. I'm just not a big fan of oversized paddles. All right, so we had the otter tail, that was the beaver tail. And then we have this last one, which is called very similar to the beaver tail, except for instead of tipping off, it's squared off. So we call this a square tip paddle. So square tip paddle versus the beaver tail, and very similar shape though in many ways to the beaver tail. This is a rather inexpensive paddle. You might be able to pick this up. I think we bought this more as decoration, to be honest, for about 10 bucks, and fairly, you know, not made with the greatest quality. There's even a bit of a torque in the paddle, but it does work still. And we have used this especially as a backup in some situations, okay? The otter tail paddle, which I have here, is a good example. This is a lake paddle. There's no questions for getting deep in the water. And these paddles tend to be used when the water is going to be more shallow. So they tend to be used more in river paddling, okay? The paddle blade is a little shorter often and cut off so that, you know, we're not going to have a tip that rounds down and hits rocks and bumps into things for us. It allows us to still get a good strong paddle stroke near the surface. And so river versus lake paddle, deep water versus shallow water, think of it that way. And the beaver tail, which I had here, is probably your sort of in-between all-rounder. And so this is what we tend to see a lot of people take, especially in Algonquin, where you can be on lakes one day and a river the next. And that's exactly what happens on our trip, is we do a fair bit of river travel. Although I'm going to be honest, most of the places in the river, the water is fairly deep, so it doesn't really matter. An otter tail will work just fine. But those are your 3 basic blade types, and they indicate what you use them for. Otter, lake, beaver tail here, sorry, kind of an all-rounder, and your square tip more for the river paddling, okay? Now I want to show you one other type of paddle because I use one, and because kids are always asking. And this paddle here is called a bent shaft. And so what they do is they bend the shaft of the blade. They bend the shaft right at the throat, okay? And this is very common. They generally don't have a really long shaft on them, so I like that about them. I'm surprised actually how short the shafts are. And then this is definitely a beaver tail style blade, okay? And I have never seen one in an otter tail. I've only seen them in beaver tails, so I don't know why they do that. They just seem to like that style. It does have a nice epoxy tip on it, and it does have some nice colored striping in the blade to make it look nice. Now you're probably asking, well, why is it bent? Well, the whole idea is if I turn sideways, I'm going to hold my paddle like this. My lower hand is down towards the throat. And what I want to do is I want to keep this blade perpendicular to the surface of the water, all right, at all times. And if I bend it forward a little bit, not backwards, a lot of kids want to do this. If I bend it backwards, what I'm actually doing is not keeping it perpendicular. I lose my perpendicularity. So here, by holding it this way, I bring this arm in a little bit. My top hand can move up, and I can reach out and I can pull and keep my paddle blade nice and perpendicular the whole time I'm paddling. What I don't want to do is see myself scooping water like this. And this just makes it a little easier to keep it more perpendicular for a longer period of time and through the power of my stroke. And so people who use these paddles are doing it for that very purpose, to keep that blade absolutely perpendicular to the surface of the water as long as possible, okay? Keep in mind, canoe paddles can be paddled both sides equally, so I can switch hands and I can just go like this, and it works the same way, okay? And I like this a lot. Because of this, it has an asymmetrical grip, very, very distinct asymmetrical grip on the top. And this is my personal paddle. I use it on all our trips when I'm canoeing. I love it. I've gotten really used to it. I'd say I almost find it a little bit awkward to go back to a straight paddle, just because this is what I've used for quite a few years now. All right. So that's your lesson on different paddles. So just a little quick reminder of the parts. We have the tip, the blade, the throat, the shaft, and the grip, okay? And we have 3 different types. We had the otter tail, which is for lake. We had the beaver tail, which is kind of a nice all-rounder. And then we had the square tip, which is more for using in, I'd say, in shallow white water, okay? So that's your lesson on canoe paddles. Hope you like that.